May 12, 1945. A German woman hurled a piece of cornbread across the mess hall. It hit the wall with a dull thud and crumbled to the floor. She laughed. Her fellow prisoners laughed. The American cook behind the counter said nothing. He simply bent down, swept up the crumbs, and walked back into the kitchen. 23 days later, that same woman would be standing at that same counter flour on her hands, asking him to teach her how to make more. This is not a story about bread. This is a story about what happens when everything you believe about your enemy turns out to be wrong, and the moment you realize it arrives not with a gunshot or a treaty, but with the smell of butter in a cast-iron skillet. In the spring of 1945, Germany was ash and rubble. Berlin had fallen. The Reich that promised 1,000 years had lasted 12. And scattered across 46 American states, nearly 375,000 German prisoners of war were waking up each morning in a country they had been trained to despise. They had been told America was soft, disorganized, a nation of jazz and chewing gum with no stomach for real discipline. They had been told American food was tasteless, its people lazy, its culture thin as paper. Then the mess hall doors opened and the trays came out. Camp Como, Mississippi operated in the flat, humid lowlands of the American South, surrounded by cotton fields and long summer heat. The camp was not a place of cruelty. It followed the Geneva Convention to the letter and often exceeded it. Prisoners received 3 meals a day. They received wages in camp script. They played soccer on weekends. They wrote letters home, and every single morning without fail, there was cornbread. For the German women interned at Camp Como, most of them former radio operators, factory supervisors, Wehrmacht clerks, and trained bakers. The cornbread was an insult wrapped in a loaf. In Germany, corn was what you fed to pigs. Full stop. There was no debate, no nuance, no regional exception. Maize was animal feed, and anyone who served it to humans was either desperate or mocking them. When they saw the yellow wedges stacked on their trays beside fried chicken and potatoes swimming in gravy, they did not say thank you. They said Schweinebrot, pig bread, and they said it loudly. The laughter in that mess hall on the first morning was real and sharp and collective. These women had survived bombing raids, government collapse, the destruction of everything they knew. Their dignity was one of the few things they still owned. Mocking American food was not petty. It was survival. It was a way of saying, you may have captured us, but you have not changed us. You may have won the war, but we are still German. We still know what real bread is. And this, whatever this yellow crumbling thing is not it. Ilse Schneider was 30 years old. She had grown up in a Berlin apartment where the smell of rye sourdough was as constant as the sound of streetcars. Her father ran a small bakery in Prenzlauer Berg. She had learned to work dough before she learned to ride a bicycle. By the time she was 16, she could judge proofing time by touching the surface with 2 fingers. By the time she was 20, she could tell the difference between wheat flours by smell alone. She had survived the war years in Germany by working in a Wehrmacht supply office, but her hands never forgot what they had learned. She was the first to pronounce the verdict on the cornbread. Coarse, she said. Animal feed baked with arrogance. The table erupted. She had given them the phrase they needed. But Ilse was also a baker, and bakers, even when they are laughing, cannot help but notice things. She noticed that the American cook who served them did not look embarrassed. He did not look apologetic. He moved through that kitchen with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and saw absolutely no reason to justify it. That bothered her. Arrogance she expected from victors. What she did not expect was contentment. That night in the barracks, the women talked. Some laughed again. Some admitted in voices barely above a whisper that they had not eaten that much food in a single sitting since before the war. Germany, in 1945, was running on less than 1,200 calories per day for most civilians. The Reich food estate, the massive agricultural apparatus Hitler had used to feed his empire, had collapsed under Allied bombing and the loss of occupied territories. Bread was rationed, stretched, sometimes mixed with sawdust in the most desperate districts. Real wheat flour was a memory, and here in a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi, there had been fried chicken. And eggs. And something called cornbread that no one would admit to having noticed smelled actually quite good. The United States in 1945 was producing 3.2 billion bushels of corn annually. That number meant nothing to the women in the barracks. What meant something was the butter. Real butter set out in small squares beside the yellow bread, without ration stamps, without limits, without explanation. The Americans put it there because they had it. That fact, so simple, so enormous, was the crack in the wall that none of the women would acknowledge out loud. By the third day, the jokes continued, but something had shifted underneath them. The youngest prisoner in Ilsa's barracks was 19 years old. Her name was Erica Meyer. She had worked as a signals clerk, and she had the kind of hunger that 19-year-olds have after years of wartime scarcity, a hunger that does not negotiate with pride. On the third afternoon, during a brief moment when attention in the mess hall moved elsewhere, Erica slipped her cornbread into her pocket. That night, in the far corner of the barracks, she ate it alone. She chewed slowly. It was dry. It was strange. It was nothing like bread she had known. And then she swallowed and sat quietly for a moment and thought, "I want more." She told no one. She would not tell anyone for another 2 weeks. Ilsa, meanwhile, had begun to watch the kitchen with the eyes she could not turn off. She watched through the mess hall window as the American cooks moved. She watched the timing, the temperature, the angle of the skillet. She watched bacon grease go in first. Watched the batter pour in a single clean motion. Watched the edges crisp in under a minute. She told herself she was watching because she was critical. She told herself she was building a case. The truth, which she would not admit for several more days, was that she was watching because she recognized something. She recognized craft. In the second week of June, the head of the camp kitchen, Sergeant Dorothy Wells, sent word through a guard that she wanted to see Ilsa Schneider. The summons came in the middle of breakfast. Every woman at the table went silent. No one knew if it was punishment or something worse. Ilsa stood, wiped her hands on her uniform trousers, and followed the guard through the swinging kitchen doors. The kitchen was nothing like the ruined bakeries of Berlin. It was clean, organized, fully stocked. Shelves ran ceiling to floor, packed with cornmeal flour, sugar, baking powder, canisters of lard, bottles of sorghum, tins of salt. The smell was yeast and butter and heat. Sergeant Wells stood at the counter with a bowl already in front of her and said without any ceremony at all, "You are the baker. I thought you might want to see how we do it here." Ilsa said nothing. She looked at the bowl of yellow batter. She looked at the skillet heating on the burner. She watched Wells pour the batter and listened to the immediate decisive hiss of contact with the hot iron. The edges went gold in seconds. Wells tilted the pan slightly, checked the underside without touching it, and set it back level. She said, "Cornbread is about timing. You rush it, it burns. You wait too long, it goes heavy. Same as anything worth making." The loaf came out of the skillet, golden and steaming. Wells cut a wedge and set it on a plate and pushed it across the counter. Ilsa picked it up. She felt the weight, the slight give of the crumb, the stiffness of the crust. She brought it close enough to smell. Butter. Corn. Something faintly sweet underneath. She put it in her mouth. The crust cracked. The interior was moist and rich and warm. It did not taste like rye. It did not taste like wheat. It tasted like something entirely itself, confident, unhurried, unapologetic. She swallowed. "It is not pig food," she said. Wells raised an eyebrow and said, "Never was." Ilsa walked back into the barracks that evening, carrying nothing but what she now knew. When the other women pressed her for what had happened, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I was wrong. It is bread. Different, but bread. There is skill in it." The room fell silent in a way that laughter had never managed. And somewhere in the kitchen, a skillet was still warm on the burner, and a bag of cornmeal sat open on the counter, and tomorrow morning the trays would come out again. But something had already changed in Camp Como, Mississippi, something that no military order had commanded and no propaganda had predicted. One trained German baker had tasted American cornbread and told the truth about it. And the truth, as it turned out, was only the beginning. In the barracks of Camp Como, Mississippi, something had cracked open. Ilsa Schneider, trained baker, proud Berliner, the woman who had called cornbread pig food in front of 40 prisoners, had walked into an American kitchen and walked out a different person. Not broken, not defeated, changed. She had tasted the bread with honest hands and told the truth about it. And that truth, quiet as it was, had hit the barracks harder than anything the guards had ever said. For 3 days after the women argued. Some called Ilsa a collaborator. Some called her weak. One woman from Hamburg refused to speak to her at all. But others, the ones who had been eating cornbread in secret for 2 weeks, felt something loosen in their chests. Permission had been granted. Not by the Americans. By one of their own. But permission is not the same as acceptance. And acceptance, it turned out, had an enemy. His name was Major Gerald Hargrove, Camp Como's commanding officer, and he had spent 22 years in the United States Army developing a precise and immovable set of opinions about how things should be done. Prisoners worked. Prisoners ate. Prisoners did not mingle with American kitchen staff. They did not receive cooking lessons. They did not stand at American stoves with American ingredients handling American food. That was not policy. That was not procedure. That was something else entirely, and Major Hargrove wanted it stopped. He summoned Sergeant Dorothy Wells to his office on a Thursday morning in mid-June. Wells stood in front of his desk while he read from a single sheet of paper without looking up. "You invited a German prisoner into the mess kitchen," he said. Not a question. "I did," Wells said. "Unsupervised." "Corporal Reeves was in the room the entire time, sir." Hargrove set the paper down. He was a man of 51 with a face that had learned not to move unnecessarily. "Sergeant Wells, these women are prisoners of war. They are not exchange students. They are not culinary apprentices. They are not your guests. The Geneva Convention requires us to feed them. It does not require us to teach them how to cook." "No, sir," Wells said. "It doesn't." "Then why?" Wells looked at him for a moment. "Because she's a baker, sir, a trained one. I thought it might help." "Help what exactly?" "Help things go better," Wells said simply. Hargrove stared at her. Then he said, "If I hear of another prisoner entering this kitchen without written authorization from my office, you will be reassigned to Fort Benning, and you will spend the remainder of this war counting mess tins. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir," Wells said. "Very clear." She walked out of his office and went directly back to the kitchen and began writing the request for written authorization. It took 11 days. Hargrove delayed it twice, redirected it once, and added 3 conditions that Wells had not expected any prisoner working in or near the kitchen must be supervised by a commissioned officer, at all times. No prisoner may handle the preparation of food intended for American personnel, and all prisoner kitchen contact must be logged in writing and submitted weekly to the commanding office. The conditions were designed to make the whole thing impractical. Wells accepted every one of them without argument and submitted the paperwork the same afternoon she received it. The authorization came through on June 27th. Ilsa returned to the kitchen the following morning with Erica Meyer beside her. The young signals clerk had finally confessed to her weeks of secret cornbread eating, 2 days after Ilsa's announcement to the barracks, and the confession had been met not with mockery, but with exhausted collective relief from half the room. Erica had not eaten cornbread once. She had eaten it 14 times. She had simply never admitted it. Lieutenant Calvin Marsh, 26 years old and deeply unhappy about his assignment as supervising officer, sat in a chair in the corner of the kitchen with a clipboard and watched. He had been told this was a cultural exchange initiative. He had written that phrase in a letter to his mother in Georgia, and she had written back that it sounded like something invented by someone who had never left Washington. Wells set Ilsa in front of the counter with a bowl, a measuring cup, and a bag of cornmeal. Erica stood beside her. Then Wells stepped back. "Same as before," she said. "But this time you make it." Ilsa looked at the ingredients. Cornmeal flour baking powder, salt buttermilk eggs, bacon fat, no rye, no sourdough starter, no caraway, nothing from the world she knew. She picked up the cornmeal and poured it into the bowl by feel adjusting by sight. Wells said nothing. Lieutenant Marsh wrote something on his clipboard. Erica watched Ilsa's hands the way you watch someone do something that looks easy and turns out not to be. Ilsa mixed dry ingredients first, then wet. She worked the batter until it was just combined, stopping before the texture went tight, which was the instinct that separated trained bakers from everyone else. She poured it into the iron skillet that Wells had already brought to temperature. The sound it made was immediate and decisive. She set the skillet in the oven and stood back. 8 minutes later, she pulled it out. The top had cracked along the center in a clean line, the edges had pulled away from the iron, and the color was an even deep gold that Wells, watching from across the kitchen, recognized as correct. Ilsa tapped the surface with one knuckle. The sound was right. She cut it open. Steam came out clean and straight. She handed the first piece to Wells. Wells ate it without ceremony and said, "You adjusted the fat." "The skillet was hotter than last time," Ilsa said. "I reduced the bacon grease by a quarter." Lieutenant Marsh had stopped writing on his clipboard. He was staring at the cornbread on the counter. Wells looked at him and said, "Lieutenant, you want a piece?" He said yes, before he realized he had decided to. That afternoon, when Ilsa and Erica returned to the barracks, they carried nothing with them. No bread, no samples, no proof. But the women who had been watching them leave that morning watched them come back and read something in how they carried themselves. Not defeat, not submission. Something more unsettling and more powerful. Competence. The next morning, 4 more women asked to go to the kitchen. Hargrove received the new authorization requests and denied 3 of them. He approved 1. Over the following 2 weeks, the pattern repeated. Request delay, partial approval, condition, added, condition met. Wells worked the bureaucracy the way Ilsa worked, Doe with patience, with pressure applied at the right moments, with no visible frustration and no wasted motion. By mid-July, 6 German women were rotating through the Camp Como kitchen on a schedule logged in triplicate and submitted weekly to the commanding office exactly as required. And then Ilsa did something no one had anticipated, and Hargrove had not thought to prohibit, because it had not occurred to him that a prisoner would think of it. She asked Wells if she could teach the American cooks something. The request arrived in Hargrove's office on a Tuesday. He read it twice. It was technically within the terms of the authorization he had already signed. Prisoner kitchen contact was approved. The direction of knowledge transfer was not specified. He sat with the paper for a long time. Outside his window, the Mississippi summer pressed down on the camp with its full weight. He thought about Fort Benning. He thought about what the men under his command were eating. He thought about a letter he had received from his own mother last Christmas, asking if he was getting enough to eat and how he had laughed at the question. He approved it. Ilsa chose rye bread. Not the desperate wartime rye of rationed Berlin, stretched thin and flavored with substitutes and shortages. The real rye, the bread of her apprenticeship, dense and dark and patient, seeded with caraway, proofed overnight, built to last a week on a shelf. She taught the American cooks to build a sponge and let it develop in the cool of the evening. She taught them to fold, not need to read the surface of the dough with fingers rather than a timer. She taught them that some things cannot be hurried and that the attempt to hurry them produces something that looks like bread but does not behave like it. The Americans were fast learners with good hands and genuine curiosity, and this surprised her more than anything else about them. She had expected them to dismiss the process as too slow, too European, too fussy for people accustomed to abundance. Instead, they leaned in. They asked questions. When the first rye loaf came out of the oven and filled the mess hall with the smell of caraway and dark crust, 3 of the German women in the food line stopped walking. One of them pressed her hand to her mouth. Not because it was exactly like home. Because it was close enough to remind her that home had existed. Major Hargrove ate a slice that evening without knowing who had taught the cook to make it. He told Lieutenant Marsh it was the best bread he had eaten since his grandmother's kitchen in South Carolina. Marsh wrote that down on his clipboard, then he crossed it out. Then he wrote it down again. By the end of July, the Camp Como kitchen was producing 2 kinds of bread. Some mornings, cornbread golden and warm from iron skillets. Some mornings, rye dark and seeded and unhurried. And some mornings, in an experiment that no regulation had foreseen and no propaganda had predicted, a hybrid. Cornmeal and rye flour together, sourdough tang meeting southern sweetness, a loaf that belonged to neither country and somehow to both. No one had ordered it. No officer had approved it. It had simply happened the way things happen when people with real skills spend enough time in the same kitchen. When hunger becomes trust, and scorn becomes curiosity. And curiosity becomes something that does not yet have a name, but feels unmistakably like the beginning of one. But the kitchen was only one room. Outside the gates, Mississippi was waiting. And Mississippi in the summer of 1945 was not ready for what was coming through those gates next. By the end of July 1945, Camp Como's kitchen had become something no military regulation had anticipated. 2 women, 1 American sergeant and 1 German baker, had turned a mess hall into a classroom. Cornbread and rye bread came out of the same ovens. Recipes crossed language barriers in handwritten notes. 6 German prisoners rotated through kitchen shifts on a schedule logged in triplicate. And a hybrid loaf that belonged to no country had begun appearing on breakfast trays without anyone having ordered it. But the kitchen was only one room. And the war, though officially over, had left behind something that does not end when documents are signed. It had left behind grief. And grief in rural Mississippi in 1945 was not ready to share its bread with anyone. Word spread the way. Word always spreads in small communities through church bulletins and feed store conversations, and the particular silence that falls over a table when someone says something that changes the temperature of the room. German women were cooking in the Camp Como kitchen. German women were working the fields alongside American farmhands. German women were in Mississippi alive and fed and learning to make cornbread, while boys from Panola County and Quitman County and Tallahatchie County were still listed as missing in action in Belgium and the Philippines and the waters off Okinawa. The first organized protest arrived at the camp gates on August 3rd. 11 women from the surrounding county dressed in their Sunday clothes carrying handwritten signs. They did not shout. They stood in the heat and held their signs, and the signs said things like, "They killed our sons and no bread for Nazis." A photographer from the local paper took a picture. The picture ran on the front page the following Thursday. Major Hargrove read the article twice. Then he called Sergeant Wells into his office. "The kitchen program," he said. "Sir," Wells said, "it's becoming visible." "It was always visible, sir. We just weren't looking at it from the road." Hargrove set the paper on his desk. He was a man who had spent his career managing the space between what was right and what was possible, and he had developed a precise sense of where that space ended. "I'm not shutting it down," he said, and Wells, who had prepared herself to argue, said nothing and waited. "But it needs to be quieter. No more press. No more situations where a civilian driving past the gate can see a German woman standing at a window with flour on her hands." "Understood," Wells said. And Wells. He looked at her directly for the first time in the conversation. "Whatever is happening in that kitchen, whatever it's doing, keep doing it. Just do it where I don't have to explain it to a grieving mother." She nodded and left. In the hallway she stopped and stood still for a moment with her hand on the wall. Then she went back to the kitchen. Inside, Ilsa was teaching a young American cook named Private Roy Delaney how to read dough. Delaney was 19 from a farm outside Vicksburg, and he had the kind of hands that learned faster than his brain could follow. Ilsa stood beside him at the counter and said nothing while he worked. When his folds went wrong, she tapped the dough once with 2 fingers to show him the resistance. He adjusted. She nodded. Erica sat at the far end of the counter, writing in a small notebook, translating recipe measurements from German approximations into American cups and tablespoons, a project she had begun without being asked because the inaccuracy of the existing translations had been bothering her for 2 weeks. Lieutenant Marsh sat in his corner with his clipboard. He had stopped pretending to be unhappy about his assignment sometime around the 3rd week of July. None of them knew about the protest at the gate. They found out that evening. The reaction in the barracks was complicated. Some of the women felt vindicated. They had said from the beginning that this was wrong, that fraternizing with the enemy was a betrayal, that the Americans were using cornbread as a weapon of cultural submission. Others who had been in the kitchen, who had stood at American stoves and felt the particular satisfaction of producing something real and good, with their hands felt something harder to name. Not guilt exactly. More like the weight of a situation that had no clean resolution. Ilsa sat on her bunk that night and did not sleep. She thought about the women with the signs. She thought about what it meant to grieve a son and watch his killers eat well. She did not have an answer. She had never had an answer. She had only had bread and the honesty required to admit when bread was good. The next morning she went back to the kitchen. This was the fact that Major Hargrove would later describe in a letter to the Department of the Army written in 1947 as the most significant thing he witnessed during his command at Camp Como. Not the hybrid bread, not the recipe exchange, not the cooking demonstrations. The fact that Ilsa Schneider, after learning that civilian protesters were standing at the gate with signs calling her a Nazi, came back to the kitchen and taught Private Roy Delaney how to score a rye loaf so the crust would crack along the right lines. She came back because the bread was real and the learning was real, and those things did not stop being real because the situation around them was painful. That was Hargrove wrote a more sophisticated understanding of reconciliation than anything the Army had managed to put in a field manual. In September, repatriation notices began arriving. The women received them in small groups, called to the administrative office, one by one, handed papers that told them when they would be going home and to what extent home still existed. The news from Germany continued to be devastating. Cities were shells. Families were scattered across occupation zones. The infrastructure of daily life had been almost completely destroyed. For many of the women, the prospect of return was more frightening than the reality of captivity had been. Ilsa received her notice on September 14th. She sat with it in the kitchen for a long time after her shift ended. Wells found her there and sat down across the counter without saying anything. After a while, Ilsa said, "My neighborhood is gone." "I know," Wells said. "The bakery is gone." "Yes." Ilse looked at the paper. "I do not know what I am going home to." Wells was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're going home knowing how to make 2 kinds of bread instead of 1. That's not nothing." It was not a solution. It was not comfort exactly. But it was honest, and Ilse had come to understand that honest was what Wells offered, and that it was worth more than false reassurance. She folded the paper and put it in her pocket and stood up and began cleaning the counter. In her final weeks at Camp Como, Ilse did something methodical and deliberate. She sat with Erica and Lieutenant Marsh and Private Delaney and Sergeant Wells, and they went through every recipe that had been developed or adapted or invented in that kitchen over the past 4 months. They wrote them down carefully. Both languages. Exact measurements. Notes on technique, on timing, on the variables that a recipe cannot capture, but a cook must know. When the cornmeal was coarse ground versus fine. How humidity affected rye proofing time. The precise moment when the hybrid loaf's crust told you it was done by the sound it made when you tapped it. The notebook was 43 pages long. Ilse kept 1 copy. Wells kept another. Private Delaney, who had not been asked, made a 3rd copy for himself in handwriting that was slow and careful and completely legible. He would carry it back to his mother's farmhouse outside Vicksburg, and she would make the rye-corn hybrid bread for the first time on a Sunday in November, and tell her son it was the best bread she had ever eaten, and ask him where in the world he had learned to make it. On October 8, 1945, Ilse Schneider boarded a transport truck with 31 other German women. The camp was quiet that morning. Early fog sat on the Mississippi fields. The kitchen lights were on. Through the mess hall window she could see someone moving at the counter, and she thought it was probably Delaney starting the morning bread. She did not wave. The truck pulled out, and the gates closed behind it, and the road stretched north through cotton fields that were still being harvested white and enormous under the pale sky. She carried the notebook in her coat. She carried 4 months of mornings in a kitchen that had not been designed for what it became. She carried the memory of a skillet hissing of dough that yielded correctly under her hands of a woman across a counter who had said, "Never was." What she would do with all of that in the ruins of Berlin, in a city that did not yet know it would be rebuilt, was not yet clear. But the bread was real. The learning was real. And those things she had decided were enough to begin with. On October 8, 1945, a truck carried Ilse Schneider north out of Camp Como, with a 43-page notebook in her coat pocket, and 4 months of American mornings in her memory. She had arrived as a prisoner who called cornbread pig food. She was leaving as something the Army had no category for, not rehabilitated, not converted, something quieter and more durable than either of those words. She was leaving as a baker who now knew 2 traditions instead of 1, and who understood in a way that no propaganda had prepared her for, that the enemy had been neither weak nor simple. They had simply been different. And different, it turned out, was not the same as wrong. The truck did not stop. The cotton fields rolled past. The gates of Camp Como disappeared behind a curve in the road, and that was the end of Mississippi. Ilse reached Berlin in November 1945. What she found was not a city. It was a decision about whether to continue. Entire blocks had been reduced to chest-high rubble. The bakery in Prenzlauer Berg where she had learned to read dough was gone, not damaged, not closed, gone, replaced by a gap in the street where weeds were already growing through broken brick. Her father had survived. He was living in 2 rooms of a building that had lost its upper floors to Allied bombing and was now shared by 11 people who had each lost something irreplaceable and were managing with the particular German stubbornness that requires no optimism to continue managing. She did not tell him about the cornbread immediately. She told him she had been in Mississippi. She told him she had worked in a kitchen. He nodded. He was a man who had spent his life making bread, and he understood that kitchens were where people went when everything else became unclear. In the spring of 1946, Ilse rented a single room at the front of a half-destroyed building on a street that had been partially cleared. She set up a table and a used oven, and she began baking. She had no commercial license, no proper equipment, no established supply chain for ingredients. What she had was the notebook and her hands and the knowledge that people in Berlin needed bread the way they needed air, not as luxury, but as proof that ordinary life had not been permanently canceled. She baked rye first because rye was what Berlin knew, and Berlin was not yet ready for anything it did not know. The bread was dark and dense and correct, and within 2 weeks she had a line of regular customers who came in the early morning and stood in the cold and waited without complaint because the bread was worth it. Then, in her 4th week, she baked the hybrid. Rye and cornmeal together, sourdough tang and southern sweetness. The loaf that had been invented in a Mississippi mess kitchen by a German prisoner and an American sergeant who had decided against orders and against grief and against the full weight of recent history that the bread was worth making. She set it out without explanation. The first customer to buy it was a man who had lost 3 sons in the war and who bought bread every morning because buying bread was something a person could still do. He tasted it on the street outside her door and stood still for a moment and then came back inside. "What is this?" he said. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. "Something I learned in America," Ilse said. He bought another loaf the following morning. He brought his wife the morning after that. By autumn of 1946, the bakery had a name painted above the door and a second oven and a young assistant who had never been to Mississippi and who learned the hybrid bread by watching Ilse's hands the same way Ilse had once watched Dorothy Wells. American soldiers stationed in the occupation zones began finding their way to the shop, drawn first by rumor and then by the smell from the street. They would stand at the counter and recognize in 1945, nearly 425,000 German prisoners of war lived in camps from Maine to California. Thousands of them worked in kitchens on farms and factories, in places where daily contact with Americans replaced the abstraction of the enemy with the specific reality of a person standing at the same counter or in the same field. Not all of those contacts were warm. Not all of them produced notebooks or hybrid bread or letters that lasted 30 years. Many of them produced nothing more than exhaustion and mutual incomprehension, and the long silence of people who have no shared language and no shared loss, and nothing to offer each other except proximity. But some of them produced something else, something that did not fit into any category the war had prepared anyone for. A farmer in Kansas who taught a German prisoner to drive a tractor and received in return a recipe for a potato soup he made every winter for the rest of his life. A cook in Louisiana who learned from a prisoner that bread proved better in humid heat if you reduced the yeast by 10%, and who passed that adjustment to her daughter, who passed it to hers. A guard in Arizona who gave a prisoner a copy of a John Steinbeck novel and received back 6 months later a handmade chess set carved from scrapwood and who kept it on his mantle until he died. None of these things changed the outcome of the war. The war was already over. What they changed was smaller and larger than that simultaneously. They changed what the people involved understood about the category of enemy, and whether that category was as permanent and as solid as they had been told. The women who stood at the gates of Camp Como with their signs were not wrong to grieve. Their grief was real, and it was earned, and no amount of good bread erases the specific weight of a son who does not come home. But grief and understanding are not opposites. They can occupy the same person at the same time, pulling in different directions, producing something that is neither forgiveness nor forgetting, but something more honest than either. Ilse Schneider baked bread in Berlin until 1979, when her hands made the decision her mind had been refusing to make for several years. The bakery closed on a Friday. Her assistant, the young woman who had learned the hybrid bread by watching Ilse's hands, opened a new bakery 2 streets away the following Monday and put the hybrid loaf on the menu as the house bread. She called it simply the house bread because she did not know what else to call something that had no country of origin and needed none. Ilse died in 1983. She left the notebook to her assistant. She left nothing else in writing about Camp Como, or the kitchen, or Dorothy Wells, or the 4 months in Mississippi, because she believed, as trained bakers generally believe, that the most important things are communicated through the hands and not through words, and that anyone who needed to understand what had happened in that kitchen could simply make the bread and find out. The notebook still exists. It is 43 pages. It is written in 2 languages. The measurements are exact, the technique, notes are careful, and on the last page in Ilse's handwriting is a single line that has no recipe number and no title. It reads, "It was never pig food. It was always home." We simply had not been there before. From a mess hall in Mississippi, where a woman threw cornbread at a wall, to a bakery in Berlin, where the same woman taught a city to eat what she had once refused. This is something they could not immediately place a flavor that was familiar and foreign at the same time. And Ilse would watch their faces and say nothing, because the recognition was its own explanation. Sergeant Dorothy Wells received a letter from Ilse in December 1946. It was written partly in German and partly in English, with a drawing of the bakery's storefront on the back of the envelope. Wells read it at the kitchen counter in Camp Como, which was in the process of being decommissioned, its prisoners long since repatriated, and its purpose concluded. She read it twice, and then folded it and kept it. She would keep every letter Ilsa wrote for the next 31 years. Private Roy Delaney went home to Vicksburg and eventually opened a restaurant. He kept the notebook copy he had made in his own slow, careful handwriting in a kitchen drawer for 40 years. When his daughter asked him once where he had learned to make dark bread that tasted like it came from somewhere else, he said from a German woman in Mississippi who was a better baker than anyone I ever met. His daughter did not entirely believe him until she found the notebook after he died and read the notes in 2 languages, and understood that her father had been for a few months in 1945 part of something that did not have a name, because no one had thought to name it. Lieutenant Marsh wrote about Camp Como in a memoir he completed in 1978 and never published. His granddaughter found the manuscript in 2019 and had it scanned and uploaded to a small historical archive maintained by a university in Mississippi. In it, he described the kitchen program as the only genuinely useful thing he did during his military service, which he acknowledged was not what the Army would have preferred to hear. He described Ilsa as the most competent person he observed in any kitchen during the entire duration of his assignment, which he noted covered both American cooks and German prisoners. He described the hybrid bread as tasting like an argument that had been resolved. He could not explain what he meant by that, but he left the phrase in because it was the most accurate thing he could write. Major Hargrove retired in 1952. In the letter he wrote to the Department of the Army in 1947, recommending that the kitchen exchange program at Camp Como be formally studied as a model for prisoner integration, he described the program's results in the careful, understated language of a man who had spent his career translating complicated human situations into bureaucratic prose. The program, he wrote, produced measurable improvements in prisoner morale, measurable reductions in disciplinary incidents, and an unexpected but documented contribution to the cultural understanding of American food traditions among a population that had arrived with significant misconceptions. He did not mention the protest at the gate. He did not mention his conversation with Dorothy Wells in the hallway. He did not mention the morning he ate a slice of rye bread made by a German prisoner and told his lieutenant it was the best bread he had tasted since his grandmother's kitchen. Some things, he had decided, were too true to put in a government document. The letter was filed and not acted upon. Here is what the documents do not capture, and what the letters only partially record. Across the United States, a story about what happens when hunger outlasts prejudice and curiosity outlasts contempt. It is a story about how ordinary people in impossible situations sometimes make something that governments could not plan and armies could not order. Not a treaty, not a monument, not a formal record of reconciliation, but a loaf of bread that belongs to nowhere and feeds everyone. Share this with someone who needs to know that understanding is possible, even between people who have every reason to hate each other. And if you know a story like this one that history forgot and a textbook never told, leave it in the comments. Because these are the stories that explain not how wars are won, but how people survive what wars leave behind. The most powerful thing a human being can do has never been to destroy. It has always been to feed.